This is the Great War Discussion Group. I'm Charlie Van Way, and our speaker for today is Mike Burke, who is a volunteer and familiar to most of you. His presentation this month, is on the training of the U.S. Army from a peacetime strength of around 200,000 men to a projected wartime strength of 4 million men. I have some personal interest in this. I had an uncle who was in West Point in 1917, and his entire class got accelerated from 4 years to 2.5 years, so they could graduate in 1919 and head over to Europe to become leaders in platoons and other infantry jobs. In any case, it represented a major 180 for President Wilson himself. And while there had been a fair amount of people of a preparation movement going on, the whole thing really took everyone by surprise. One congressman supposedly even said, "Wait a minute, you mean we're actually going to have to send troops over to Europe?" So this was a major effort and was really started pretty much from scratch. So Mike is going to talk about how they did that and where the troops trained and how they trained. Mike, go ahead.
All right. Well, hey, thank you, Charlie, and good afternoon, sports fans. Welcome to my discussion, as Charlie said, about where our service members trained. And I'm going to not only talk about the Army, but I'll talk about the Marine Corps, Navy, and even the aviation type people. I kind of got interested in this subject while I was researching our discussion on the shoulder sleeve insignia. I chanced upon this rather eclectic website. It's called the Glenn Jekvik and John Vick Archives. And if you look on the left-hand side of the slide, it talks about immigration history, talks about where the immigrants came from, how they got to Ellis Island, talks about ship travel. It also has a discussion about food and vintage uniform or vintage clothing, as well as chocolates. And so that's on the left-hand side when you open up the website. But also, if you'll see it, like it says on the right-hand side, it's got its military collections archives. And as you see on this particular side, I chanced upon this and saw it, and it said, this is all this discussion about, how the U.S. Government created these training sites in order to go ahead and, take a civilian, with maybe a post-Civil War mentality, or military anyway, and turn them into a modern military army capable of fighting on the Western Front. And so, as Charlie said, the America's decision to end the war essentially caught the War Department by surprise. And so, America's allies were asking for feet on the ground as soon as possible. So they had to go ahead and find these soldiers. They had to provide them equipment. They had to get them to the training site. But more importantly, they also had to figure out where it was that they were going to train. So they came up with a plan. Each of the services had their own plan for how they were going to bring people in, how they were going to go ahead and get them their basic training, and how they were going to get them out to Europe, essentially. So upper left that's Camp Kelly. That's where aviation training was conducted. Upper right is the Great Lakes Naval Training Center outside of Chicago. Lower right is Paris Island, which gets established during the First World War. And then the bottom left is Camp Devens in Massachusetts. So there's just one of a lot of camps, various camps that were stood up during the war. So here's my agenda. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So with regards to the Army, and I'll start with the Army, then transition to the Marine Corps. The National Army, Army forces that are part of the AEF are addressed as the National Army. The National Army is made up of what was the original regular Army, which was very small, and the National Guard, which is actually very large, kind of similar to what it had been for a very long time. And so when the decision was made to go ahead and to combine this army, that's, again, we become the National Army. And then the military started thinking about, again, where are we going to go ahead and train all of this? Not only that, but how are we going to who's going to fund this? And so, interestingly enough, Congress set aside an astronomically large figure of $3 billion, that's with a B, $3 billion set aside just to train and equip a modern army. And essentially, that gave the three services an opportunity to think about what did we have, what did we need, and then where would we put that, right? And so we'll find out as we go through the discussion today that some of them took existing training locations, some of them glommed on to other locations that were not necessarily set aside for training, and then additional locations will be established for these various training sites. Before I get into this discussion of where, I would like to talk a little bit about the discussion of what's really needed, right? And so, again, think about it. Each of these cantonments for the Army, anyway, were designed for what was referred to as a Pershing division, which is approximately 228,000 soldiers, between 28 and 30,000 soldiers. It would include staff personnel, support personnel, civilians as well. And you're really talking about building what's equivalent of a very small city, because you've got, as it says here, you got to take care of building. Where are these people going to sleep? Where are they going to live? You got to talk about where are they going to be fed? How are you going to feed them? Once you get them in, you got to go ahead and equip them. So you need warehouses for that. Then you got to go ahead and train them. You got to be able to bring them to the cantonment site, and then when they leave the cantonment site, you got to get them to their port of embarkation. And you need health services as well. And then something new in this particular war that's has kind of stuck around to our current day is recreation. And I'll talk about an organization that was created to combat the evil ways of the Army during the punitive expedition. So the next couple of slides, you're going to kind of talk about these things or depict these things that I've just talked about. So upper right is the basic lodging. You've got at least you've got a wooden structure. They got the good old Army cot that probably hasn't changed in over 100 years, and soldiers living, head to foot. Lower left is one of the larger cantonment areas. That's actually Camp Dix in New Jersey, getting along to where the billeting was. And so you'll have some of these cantonment areas have got wooden buildings. You go like Camp Doniphan, which were the 35th Division trained. They were living in tents. It was basically how much money did the Army want to put into that particular site. Time to feed them. So you've got, the old dining hall, the old mess hall that I remember when I first came into the service, everything lined up, dressed. And then you've got lower right, you've got the Navy doing training out in the field for its sailors. Here you got the basic training. So you've got rifle, that's an unnamed camp on the upper left where guys are going through basic rifle marksmanship. And on the right, that's a training site in Pennsylvania where they're going through training with the machine gun. We were talking about bayonet training, so that's the lower left. And that's at San Antonio, Texas. And then I particularly like this photograph on the lower right. All of you who served in the Army, all of you who suffered through the daily dozen calisthenics every morning, you can see that the Army has been torturing soldiers with the high jumper all the way back to at least 1917. A little bit about transportation. So you've got this is upper left is the railhead at Camp Funston, with the civilians coming in to be turned into soldiers. I cheated a little bit. The upper right is actually taken in France, but not only do we have to move our soldiers from point A to point B, but we have to take the animals that we have that are pulling our gun carriages and our supply wagons. They also have to be loaded and moved from one location to another. You've got all these soldiers. You got to go ahead and wash their uniforms. And so the lower left is as it says, is Camp Funston Laundry. It was big enough that it was manned or serviced or taken care of by over 300 women who washed the uniforms of the soldiers there at Camp Funston. And then, what did Camp Funston look like? That's kind of like the lower right. So when General Leonard Wood, who's the commander of the 1st Division, stepped out onto his steps and looked over his domain, this is what he was looking at. A fairly substantial small city, as I've earlier described. A little bit about medical, right? So you've got these individuals who may or may not have been subject to, preventive medical care. So you've got to get them in. You got to get their teeth looked at. You got to look at their physical conditioning. You got to give them their shots, which everybody gets when you get in the service, right? Hundreds of shots, or at least dozens of shots. Some of them had medical issues that needed to be taken care of with surgeries, and then obviously a lot of soldiers were injured during training, and so you had bones set and people mending in hospital, and so that's that lower left photograph talks a little bit about a ward. Talking about the size of some of these hospitals, the base hospital at Camp Dix in New Jersey had 75 buildings. So if you think about it, it was almost, the hospital complex was almost a separate city within inside a larger city for all of the training that was taking place there at Camp Dix. With a little local flavor with regards to Kansas City, upper right obviously is Lieutenant William Fitzsimmons, doctor here in Kansas City, volunteered for active duty, or is called active duty, volunteered for service overseas. He left Kansas City on 14 June of 1917. He was assigned to base hospital number 5, which was servicing or taking care of British soldiers. He and 3 other soldiers, as you know, were killed in a German air raid on the 4th of September of 1917. And he is generally recognized as the first officer that was killed during the war. In July of 1920, lower right photograph, Army Hospital number 21, located in Aurora, Colorado. It was officially renamed the Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in his honor. Eventually, it grew to 86 buildings with a capacity of over 1,400 patients. Those of you familiar with the military serving at the late 80s will know that part of the peace dividend after the fall of the Soviet Union was the look at military facilities, camps, forts, other locations. The Department of Defense set up something called the Base Realignment and Closure Program, commonly referred to as BRAC. And then the BRAC Commission eventually determined that the Fitzsimmons Army Hospital complex would be shut down, and it was closed in 1996. The grounds were then redeveloped for civilian use, and so part of it became a medical campus, and then the other part is a Fitzsimmons Innovation Community. And so you'll see that, I think, as we go a little bit later on, as I look at some of the other camps that became forts that eventually became closed by BRAC. There's a little bit of a history with that as well. And then the last thing I kind of alluded to earlier was recreation, right? So, one of the other things that the military leaders had to address is how we're going to go ahead and take care of soldiers and Marines and sailors as well. What are we going to do to take care of them while they're not training, right? So what did the Department of Defense or the War Department do? They came up with this organization called the Commission for Training Camp Activities. Essentially, the idea begins way back, as you see, in August of 1916. President Wilson was a reformer. President Wilson wanted to kind of change the way he was progressive. He wanted to change the way people lived. And so when we deployed military forces for the punitive expedition to Mexico, as it says, he sent the reformer Raymond Fosdick to go down and to observe what was happening in the camps along the border with Mexico. And Fosdick came back and essentially reported terrible scenes of disorder, drunkenness, and sexual immorality, which was shocking to all of them. And he essentially envisioned a progress or a solution to go ahead and change that, and then allowing the soldiers to become a little bit less brutal, less drunken, less whatever, and an idea to go ahead and attack those evils associated with what was going on prior to this war. And so What they did is the commission linked up with 7 different organizations, and these organizations each had a different role in both here in the States, en route to Europe, and in Europe as well. So I'm going to briefly talk about each of the 7 partners in the Commission for Training Camp Activities. So first up, YWCA. I think we're all familiar with that. I think we've all seen this poster as well. And the YMCA essentially provided recreational activities, allowed a place for service members to come in and sit down. They could write letters home. They could borrow their library books. They could do Bible study if that was something they were interested. There were also religious services being held in YMCA facilities. And every cantonment, regardless of what service, would have had 1, possibly 2 YMCA halls. The YWCA is the next organization that was involved in it, and they operated what was called hostess houses. And every cantonment had a hostess house. And not only did they take care of service members, opportunity for young men to interact with women organized in a chaperone section, but they also provided services for women who were now moving into the industries, right? So maybe a woman was leaving home for the first time. Parents were concerned about who was going to kind of look over them. So they ran dormitories. They ran special facilities just for women who were working in the military-industrial complex. Though obviously we don't talk about it in that particular side. But essentially, they were taking care of both service members as well as young ladies who were working in the industry. You had the Jewish Welfare Board, which obviously primarily focusing on Jewish individuals of Jewish faith, and so they worked to provide them with kosher food. They took care of their Passover meals. They set up holiday services, and then they also went ahead and started looking for rabbis who would become the first Jewish chaplains in the U.S. Army. So then they started providing assistance to these new chaplains so that they could provide assistance to the Jewish soldiers. Next up would be the Knights of Columbus. They essentially raised money to establish Knights of Columbus huts, where the slogan was "Everyone welcome and everything free." And again, in these huts, soldiers had the opportunity to go to Mass. They could go to confession, preferably before Mass. They had the opportunity to go to music recitals. They could go to sporting events. They could watch a movie. They could do a dance. They had dances. They could go ahead and write letters back to home. It's estimated that Knights of Columbus provided 1,800 tons of stationery to soldiers who wrote home. And I think downstairs, when we get, if you look at in the Bergman Family Gala, if you look at some of the letters written home by our balloonist, you'll see that they'll actually say Knights of Columbus, or they'll say the YMCA. Salvation Army. A lot of folks are familiar with the Salvation Army, and they're not only known for serving donuts to soldiers while they were transiting across the U.S. or waiting to get on a ship or on board the ship, or even while they arrived in Europe. Eventually, more than 200 volunteers from the Salvation Army are going to go overseas. They're going to be issued with the same sort of military equipment that service members are, in terms of a small box respirator, a blanket to sleep in, a protective rubberized sheet to lay on the ground. They even carried revolvers because Salvation Army members were serving as close to the front lines as they possibly could. And so they passed out their share of donuts, but they also worked in field hospitals. They worked in canteens, and they also assisted with religious services as well. Next up is the American Library Association. Essentially raised money to supply books. It's estimated that from the $5 million that they received in donations, they erected 36 libraries and distributed between 7 to 10 million books and magazines to service members, both here in the States as well as overseas. And then obviously last but not least would be the Camp Community Service. Most of their work essentially was done to provide provide services to young service members, regardless of whatever service. The poster here is Navy sailors being going to looks like almost a semi-formal dinner. But the other thing that the camp community service provided was care to family members who may be visiting their loved ones in whatever particular camp that they were. And so they kind of took care of not only the service members, but they took care of their family as well. And so a lot of the camps had their little hostess houses, for lack of a better word, outside of the camp where the family members could stay. They could have dinner with their family members. They could have dances. They could go ahead and just visit with their family, something I think that was different or novel in its time. So essentially, this is kind of a summary of of the CTAC. You've got the young men sitting there reading their books. You've got the Jewish Welfare Board inviting people in there. A little bit of pool down there by the Knights of Columbus, and then you see the hostess house there at the Naval Training Center at Great Lakes Training Center. So I've talked a little bit about what is required. So now let's go ahead and get into the where. So first off, I'm going to talk about the regular Army. And so essentially at the beginning of the war, there are 16 regular Army camps spread. And I know the map is hard to see, but they are spread across the states for the most part. And these essentially are the regular Army camps. And this may be a little bit easier to see, essentially. With that money that was set aside, construction of the camps began in June of 1917. And by September of 1917, all of the camps were up and running. It's estimated that over 300,000 laborers were hired by contractors to go ahead and develop each of these 36 camps in addition to the camps that the Marines and the Navy are going to have as well. And for the most part, a lot of these did not exist prior to 1917. There are three that are here, or two that are here that were prior to 1917. You'll see Camp Dodge, which is located in Des Moines, and that was established in 1907, mostly for the Iowa National Guard. So it was a training center long before it was selected to be a regular Army camp. And then if you go down to Camp Travis down there in San Antonio, that was established in 1916, again, as a supporting base for the punitive expedition to Mexico. You see the dates where they established. You also see what units trained there. In most cases, it really was just one division. Some of the larger cantonments or camps had more than one, as you see there. And then on the right-hand side, you will be able to see what its current status is. And so one or two of them were closed and disassembled in the 20s after the end of the war. I think most of them were turned into either National Guard or reserve training centers. And then the large majority of them ended up staying as active duty forts, either reactivated during World War II and then maintained afterwards during the Cold War. And then, like I said, some of them have turned back over to National Guard training sites. So that is the regular Army camps. Talk a little bit about the National Guard camps. Poster on the right, the postcard on the right is Camp Doniphan, which I mentioned earlier. The soldiers lived in tents. And then the postcard on the left is Camp Green, where you see they've got a much more modern capability. Again, there were 16 National Guard training sites, so a total of 32 Army sites. And this next slide, we'll talk about what they were and where they were established. Right. We've got three that were established long before the war. If you look at Camp Beauregard there in Alexandria, Louisiana, that was established in 1905, and that was set up for, again, training the Louisiana National Guard. Number two would be Camp Cody, which is in Deming, New Mexico. And that was established also as a staging base for the punitive expedition into Mexico. And then the third would be Camp McClellan, which is established in 1898. And that was actually established to support U.S. forces traveling to the Spanish-American War. And so these three were established long before 1917. The other ones, as you see, all got established and set up beginning in June and July of 1917. And then again, you see the divisions that are associated with each of them. And then what I thought was rather interesting, not surprising, kind of interesting was that the bulk of these National Guard or these National Guard camps were all abandoned or dismantled and abandoned right after the war. As early as 1919, as late as 1920, the bulk of them were closed. What I was reading essentially said that cities could come in, they could buy the barracks, they could buy the plumbing, they could buy all of the electrical wiring, and they would just buy the entire building, break it down, ship, put it on a train, and then ship it back to where they needed it. Some of them eventually were turned over to the state. Bowie in Fort Worth, Texas, is now a National Guard training site. McClellan was an active duty site for a very long time. That was, if you remember, that was the where the Women's Army Corps was stood up during the Second World War, and that lasted until the BRAC closed it in 1999. But for the most part, these National Guard training sites were disestablished as soon as the war was over, and everything that was sellable was sold. So I've been talking about the camps where they were located. I really want to talk now just about what did one camp really look like. And so I've picked one of our favorite, Camp Jackson in South Carolina. Within 90 days, they built 1,519 buildings. And so this is kind of a list of the buildings that they built for the 81st Division. And then again, going back to the idea that it's kind of a small little city, take a look at the stables, right? So at this time in the military, officers were required to ride every day. So you had to have a place for the horses to be taken care of. You had to have indoor riding halls. You had to have outdoor riding halls. You had to ensure that officers took care of their requirement to ride. 51 storehouses, again, bringing in all the equipment necessary for taking care of the training. A mess hall. So you had to bring food in, you had to store food, you had to cook food, and then you had to take care of all of the waste from that. So there had to be a system set up to police all of that. They had to put electrical wiring, you had telephones and telegraph. You had to be able to provide hot water. You had to be able to provide sewage disposal for each of the buildings. And then again, you had that base hospital where all of these new service members were taken care of. And so essentially, they truly were little cities or minor cities established for all of these particular camps. Museum does a pretty good job talking about this initial training period. So we've got this exhibit in the West Gallery as you get over towards the caisson and the uniforms. It also does a really pretty good job talking about some of the lack of real equipment necessary for training. The 2 wooden rifles that soldiers use for drill and ceremonies, DNC, as well as the obsolete machine gun that they were issued, that Colt machine gun there in the bottom. As I was prepping for this, when I was looking at this photograph and looking at this exhibit, I suddenly saw here, Camp Merritt in New Jersey. You'll notice that it's neither a regular Army nor a National Guard site. So I did a deep dive. And so what was Camp Merritt? So Camp Merritt was actually, it became an embarkation point. It was initially established in 1898. It was used as a marshaling center for American soldiers that were transitioning to the Philippines and Guam for occupation duty after the Spanish-American War. It was shut down in a couple of years after that, and then along with the other bases in June of 1917, it was established. And so a lot of different people passed through Camp Merritt. Some of note would be Captain Harry S. Truman. On his way to Europe, he and his battery transited through Camp Merritt. Sergeant Alvin York, on his return back home to North Carolina, came through Camp Merritt. I'm not sure anybody will remember, but there was an entertainer named Arthur Godfrey. As a 15-year-old, he became a clerk typist in the headquarters there at Camp Merritt. An individual named Thomas C. Neubauer was the first Mormon to receive the Medal of Honor. He was a service member that passed out through Camp Merritt on his way to the war. And then there was an individual named George L. Fox who passed through en route to Europe, where he served as an ambulance driver receiving a Purple Heart and a Silver Star for his actions during the war. He returned home, got the calling, became a Methodist minister. When World War II began, he volunteered service as a chaplain. And then he and three other chaplains perished in the sinking of the U.S. troop ship Dorchester, which was sunk by a German submarine on February 3rd, 1943. But what's interesting about that is that these four chaplains gave up their life preservers and thus saving four of the soldiers. And so they're now immortalized as the four chaplains or the immortal chaplains. So again, an individual who had his mettle tested during the First World War, who came back and continued service during the Second World War. All right, I'm going to transition to the Marine Corps. So the Marine Corps size in April of 1917 was approximately 13,000 officers and men. About 2,000 were stationed on board ships across wherever the ships were, obviously. A large portion of them were serving overseas in China, Guam, Haiti, Hawaiian Islands, Nicaragua. Those last couple of ones were left over from the Banana Wars, which began in 1900, where we were using Marines to establish security for some of our larger corporations. And there were about another 6,000 Marines that were stationed here in the United States. The Marines, just like the Army, with the beginning of the war, had an issue with, where are we going to train these folks, right? A lot of what we now know as military facilities that the Marines have didn't exist at the time. And so initially they were held at the naval yards in Philadelphia and Norfolk, where they were in process and kind of began their basic training. But then quickly as possible, the Marines established two basic training sites. So one is Parris Island, which we now know is the East Coast training site. And the other one was Mare Island, California, which was also a large naval site as well. But those became the basic training sites. And so once they were up and running, Marine Corps recruits would travel there. They'd spend 8 to 9 weeks, depending on which location for their basic training. And then they would travel to Quantico, Virginia, where they would join the officers. And that's where the three groups of individuals would receive their training. So Parris Island and Mare Island, essentially, then on to Quantico. Sorry, I got to pause. I had to catch up to my notes. So I had read, or I believed I had read, that there was a pushback from Pershing and other Army officers regarding the use of Marines during this particular war. I think the idea was let the Marines stay where they were. We didn't really need them. Upon further reflection, Pershing really never had an issue with Marines. The only thing that he was concerned about was a separate Marine division, which may not have been under his chain of command as commander of the AEF. He never really spoke out against them. So essentially, Marines will be assigned to the AEF. And as we all know, about 24,000 Marines will serve being assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division. A lot of times when we have visitors come through, if they're military, if they're veterans or currently serving, I like to quiz them as to which Army division was commanded by a Marine general. And one or two will know, but for the most part, some of them don't. So I just kind of remind them it was the 2nd Infantry Division that was actually commanded by a Marine general. And the reason that division was commanded is because the Marines deployed the 4th Brigade of the U.S. Marines, which was made up of 3rd Battalion, or 5th Battalion and 6th Battalion regiments of the Marines, as well as the 6th Marine Machine Gun Battalion. And so, and I had always thought that there was only one, General Lejeune, who Camp Lejeune is named after. But in actuality, it was commanded by 2 Marine generals. And so for about a 10-day period in 1917, Brigadier General Doyen, pictured here on the upper left, commanded the division. Unfortunately, at the time, he was ill, and he could only command for, like I said, that 10 days before he was relieved by an Army general. And then General Lejeune actually commanded the division from 28 July 1918 through the end of August of 1919. And so he commanded the 2nd Infantry Division during the last battles of the war, and he led them as they marched into Germany to to occupy Germany. A slight connection between the 4th Brigade of the Marines and what we have in the museum is many of you will probably obviously remember the USS von Steuben, right? And then the von Steuben was a troop ship, right? The connection with the von Steuben is with the British 4.7-inch naval gun here that you see here. And if you remember, this naval gun was placed on board the don't check my thing. It was on board the La Corentina, which was captured by the German surface raider, the Crown Prince William. And then once we began, which was interred in Hampton Roads, Virginia. And then once we declared war, we turned the Crown Prince William into USS von Steuben. And then the USS von Steuben carried soldiers from 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines to Europe. And so that is our connection with the Marines through, indirect as it may be, through the naval gun here, through the ship that the gun was served on. One of the interesting things that I found out was I had always assumed like we had a National Guard and Army Reserve that the Marines had in our Marine Corps Reserve. But in actuality, it wasn't until World War I that they did. I was unaware of the fact that there was something called the Naval Militia, and the Naval Militia was stationed all the way, throughout the United States. They were part of the Naval Militia, so it was the Navy, obviously, because the Marine Corps is a sub-part of the Navy. And these folks, not very large in numbers, but again, like a reservist or a guardsman, you could serve your time in a Naval Militia and a Marine Corps unit. Which worked fine for the Civil War, worked fine for the Spanish-American War, but wasn't really going to be practical for World War I. And so there had been several efforts to go ahead and create a Naval Reserve, create a Marine Corps Reserve. And it really wasn't until the fall of 1916 that Congress eventually passed a resolution which established the Marine Corps Reserve and the Naval Reserve. When war was declared, everybody who was a militiaman reported to their mustering location where they were automatically sworn into either the Marine Corps or the Navy. And as the organization, as the militia, eventually was just disbanded. All right, so let's go ahead and move on a little bit to the Navy. So essentially, the Navy was about 59,000 at the beginning of the war. And by the end of the war, there's going to be 530,000. So there's going to be a significant increase in individuals. In that 19-month period of time, the Navy is going to train about 400,000 men. And again, they face the same sort of situation that all the other services did. Where are they going to do that? The Navy had 4 training locations: the Great Lakes in Illinois, outside Chicago, one in Newport, Rhode Island, second Yorba Linda in California, and then another one again in Norfolk. And so those had been around for a while. They were ramped up a little bit. Eventually, they were able to go ahead and train about 191,000 through those 4 training locations. I kind of found it interesting that the Navy estimated that it would take $1.5 million, and so they let a contract for that. But eventually it became a total of $75 million. So even in those days, we had problems with cost overrun and government contracts not coming in on time or to specification. Realizing they needed some more training sites, so they added 3 more training sites to the 4 that I mentioned: one in Hampton Roads, one in Philadelphia, and another one in Brooklyn. So eventually, these 7 training facilities will be sufficient to train that 400,000 sailors that I mentioned just a little bit earlier. So what were they training these sailors to do? So, well, all of the things that sailors have to do. So you've got individuals that are gunners, and so that's the picture that just flashed is Naval Gunnery School at one of the training sites. You had signalmen. So there you got on the bottom, you got a guy who's using semaphore flags to send a message. You got carpenters, you got machinists, you got ship fitters. Yeah, ship fitters. You got electricians, oilers, blacksmiths, carpenters, storekeepers, bakers, and cooks. You got all these various specialties that are required, that the Navy requires to go ahead and make things happen for them. The size of the military, we weren't really prepared for the First World War like the other services. And essentially, by the time that we declared war, the Navy, I wouldn't say relegated, but the Navy was essentially assigned the mission of escorting convoys from the United States to England and Ireland. And they were also doing convoy duty in the Mediterranean, escorting shipping through the Mediterranean. Um, and with that, we ended up using, we had to use the ships that we had. And so there were only 14 modern battleships. And that upper right-hand picture that I'm kind of moving over here, that's the South Carolina. And that is one of the dreadnought battleships that we had. They were able to go ahead and complete 2 more before the end of the war. And then with the old pre-dreadnought battleships, that was sufficient enough to go ahead and to both conduct convoy escort, as well as naval training as well. With regard to cruisers, the Navy hadn't built any new cruisers since 1908. And so they had, this is kind of interesting. I'm not a Navy guy, so I'm not saying that I'm going to do it, but there were things called armored cruisers, there were protected cruisers, and there were newer scout cruisers. And so obviously each of them was designed to take care of whatever it was that the mission they were given. But again, I didn't know that we had armored, protected, and scout cruisers. Obviously, we had a lot of destroyers. 52 is an O'Brien class destroyer, USS Nicholson, which is an O'Brien class destroyer, and essentially we would build another 46 destroyers that would escort the convoys as they went across the Atlantic and all. Submarine strength was about 49. Excuse me. We're going to build another 30 subs, and to include the ocean-going subs as well. The U.S. Navy lost 4 ships during the First World War, only one to enemy contact, and then one of the other ones disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle. So they actually did really pretty well in terms of losses during the war. I put the bottom one here, it's the one that just flashed on the lower right, because it's kind of an interesting history. That is the USS Olympia. And if you're familiar with the history of the USS Olympia, you'll know that it was Dewey's flagship that he sailed into Manila Bay during the Spanish-American, or the Spanish-American War. During the war, it served as a training ship. We've talked about how U.S. and Allied forces were provided to Russia to assist, to keep the Bolsheviks from capturing all of the supplies that we had left for the Russian forces. And so the Olympia was also there's kind of an escort vessel. And then if you've been to Philadelphia and you've seen it, because it's now a naval museum, it was the Olympia that carried back the bodies of the first unknown soldiers from the First World War. So again, if you get a chance out there to go ahead to Philadelphia, you want to go ahead and tour the Olympia. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, talk a little bit about aviation training. So we all know that the history of aviation training begins on 8 October of 1909, where Wilbur Wright's going to go ahead and train 2 Army officers to become the first Army aviators. Training is taking place at Fort Myers in Virginia, and that's a photograph of Fort Myers. Quite frankly, they wanted to continue aviation training at Fort Myers, but the base commander, who was a cavalry officer, didn't think it was a good idea. He didn't like the idea that the airplanes were scaring his horses, and so he forced the Army to move their initial flight training to up into Maryland, into College Park, Maryland. Problem with Maryland is it gets wintertime, right? So consequently, they start developing training sites in the South where they go ahead and get better weather, and they can go ahead and train year round. So you can establish Sam Houston, North Island in San Diego, and another one in Augusta. When the war begins, we're really not organized necessarily. We're not really sure how we want to organize to train our aviation crews, whether it's pilots, observers, or bomber crews. And so we adopt the British training system of ground training, if you successfully pass that, the primary flight training, and then on to specialized training. So again, that's where we're going to copy the British system. So ground training, essentially conducted at a lot of different locations. Actually became very popular at colleges. One of this is Princeton on the right, and the other one is, double check my notes, is MIT on the left, right? And so a lot of individuals in college, a lot of them decided that they want to become pilots, and so they went ahead and did that. Additional training was conducted at the University of California, University of Georgia School of Technology, And eventually a couple of other Army aviation sites were established as well. Primary flight training occurred all over the U.S. The photograph here is from Pennsylvania. This is a naval seaplane training location. And the other one, obviously, is a poster getting people involved and interested in volunteering for naval service. We'll check. Yeah, there's probably 6 different sites that they've established. Again, New Jersey, New York, Texas, San Diego, California, and then PA as well. So those were the primary flight training. After successfully completing primary flight training, you can go ahead and dive off into one of 3 specialties. And so one was pursuit, the other was observation, and the last one was bombardment. And so the photographs, this is a rudimentary gun training system for a pilot. Kind of interesting. Probably did a pretty good job. Observation on the right, bombing on the left. The aircraft there is actually a French airplane, a Brigeau at 14, which is what the U.S. First Day Bombardment Group used during the war. Pursuit training was instructed in Florida and Texas. Observation training was at Langley Field, Caulfield, Post Field, Langley Field, and Selfridge Field. And then the bombing place took place at Ellington and a place called Christopher Field. I didn't write down the state, so I apologize for that. Only about 1,000 of the 1,100 aviators that we trained actually made it to the First World War. Most of them were used for observation, looking at artillery observation, looking for targets. Obviously, many of them were air-to-air combat and pursuit aircraft. And then, obviously, we had at least one bombardment group that dropped bombs during the First World War. At the end of the war, a lot of these training sites were shut down. Some were kept. Some of them were turned over to local communities. The First World War, as we all know, spurred interest in aviation travel as well. And so a lot of these previous training sites were turned over to the local communities, which used them for their own airports as well. Talk briefly about not quite aviators, but we do have a connection with them, and that's balloon training, right? So during World War I, aerial observation was by balloon was increased. The use of balloons were increased from what had occurred before in the Civil War. They'd gotten away from the hot air balloons more to these kite balloons, which you see on the right. Obviously, we know that the issue with the kite balloons is that you have bladders on the inside, which were filled with helium. Not necessarily good for incendiary bullets, but that's essentially what kept them afloat or in flight. And then they were attached to a winch device that would put them up to about 30, put them up as high as necessary for the observer to go ahead and do what he had to do with regards to observing the potential enemy targets. Crews consisted of a balloon officer, that's the guy inside the basket. They had a pilot. It had an OIC, so you had the balloon officer, which was observing, had somebody alongside him as the pilot. You had an officer in charge. You had a commander to the ground station, so that's the person responsible for everything on the ground, and a ground crew. Ground crew could be up to, I want to say, 12 individuals, because while there was a winch there, sometimes the winches didn't work, and so they needed the bodies to go ahead and raise and lower the balloon. There was, double check. So they were organized like most things in the Army. They had companies, they had battalions, and they had brigades. So they didn't necessarily call them brigades, they call them something else. And of all of the individuals that they were trained in San Antonio, Texas, Houston, Newport, Virginia, Omaha, Nebraska, and Arcadia, California were the 4 Army balloon training sites. Essentially, only 35 out of the 110 companies that were established during the First World War made it to Europe, where they flew 1,600 combat missions, and the other groups 6 other groups were on their way to Europe when the armistice was signed. I want to highlight the connection between balloon training and what we have in the museum, and obviously I'm talking about Mail Call and Ellis Gallery, as well as the observation basket, the Bergman Family Gallery. And as a reminder, the training at San Antonio was actually conducted at Camp Weiss. And so you'll see that address on some of the envelopes that John Myers wrote to his son, Walter. And then you've got the envelopes because his training continued in Virginia. And then obviously he was deployed overseas to France. And so that is our connection to the balloon training. After training, obviously our service members were deployed overseas. And so almost all of them traveled by train to their ports. It's said that 4 out of 5 deploying service members came out of New York, probably out of Camp Merritt. I guess the other ones probably came out of Texas through Galveston would be my assumption. But eventually they made their way overseas, and from there they go ahead and started training again. And so we established cantonment areas in Belgium and England and France for U.S. service members. But for the most part, while they were training with the French and the British, they were, in French camps, in British camps, while they were being trained on that various pieces of equipment, essentially. And so here you see Frenchmen learning to shoot a .45. You've got Americans shooting. I forgot to see what that photograph was. I apologize. You've got the Vickers machine gun. You've got a couple of Americans testing 4 different small box or respirators, and you've got Americans training on their FT-17 tanks on the bottom. So, in conclusion, to say that on 6 April of 1917, when Congress declared war on the Central Powers, there was a tremendous pressure on General Pershing and the American government to go ahead and provide as many forces, as many soldiers, as many service members as they could, as quickly as possible. So we know that 4 million were drafted, another 700,000 will volunteer for military service. And so in addition to equipping, we went ahead and had to train them. So responding to Flagg's call for military service, we had all of those service members arriving for training. Training, as I kind of pointed out, was conducted at the various locations that I've earlier described. And were essentially, they did, I think the military, our military did a pretty good job of providing basic and some advanced training for what the service members needed to be able to be successful overseas or over there. While historians can argue about the relative fighting ability or successes of American forces, few could argue that, quite frankly, our commitment and our service helped bring about, that was referring back to the training that I kind of forgot about, that helped contribute to the armistice that was signed on 11 November of 1918. And so again, we can let the historians argue about whether they were successful or not, but I want to kind of end with, what did our adversaries say about American commitment to during the war? And so these are just 3 quotes from 3 individuals. And so I end with one last connection to the museum. I think many of us have been kind of surprised, at least I have been surprised about how much I'd forgotten about what was in Memory Hall for those years that the virtual reality experience was up there. But we do have a map of the United States that shows where all of the U.S. forces train. And it is that map right there. It's kind of hard to see because I couldn't get close enough to get a good shot. But if you haven't seen it or you forgot where it is, when you come into the museum, or you come into Memory Hall, it's on the left right after you pass the artifacts, the Fitzsimmons artifacts on the left. So we do have a map that pinpoints all of the training locations. These are my references. And as again, I relied heavily on the archives that I described earlier on. And with that, I will ask if there are any questions or comments.
Any questions for Mike?
I see one question. Cameron asked a question, was there any preparation or planning by those in authority? And so the answer is, yeah, kind of, essentially. If I remember correctly, while Wilson was obviously anti-war, he wanted to keep us out of it, there was a preparedness movement that began in Congress, included leading citizens in the United States, that essentially realized that sooner or later we were going to have to get involved in the war. And so they were pushing for military reforms. They were pushing for military preparedness. I would like to think that's probably one of the reasons why that Congress enacted the law to go ahead and establish the Navy and the Marine Corps reserves as early. I mean, in 1916, the year, a couple of months before we decided the end of the war. So I guess the answer was we're not completely flat-footed, but we weren't completely prepared as well.
There was a constant tension going on because the French and the English wanted Americans to send only combat troops, infantrymen and machine gunners, whereas the president and of course Pershing wanted to send elements of a fully functioning American army. The Europeans wanted to simply plug the U.S. troops into gaps in their own line and have them serve under British and French officers, even wearing British and French uniforms. And some of that was actually done. But this was one of the constant tensions. And the British in particular used that request as sort of a club, saying that either you send us what we want to get and let them serve in our ranks, or we won't give you any ships. And getting enough shipping to get troops across the Atlantic was a chronic headache for both Pershing himself and for the people doing the training in the U.S. Clearly, the British could have done more than they did, but to be fair, they were getting stretched fairly heavily by all the demands on their shipping.
Yeah, there's actually Pershing in his biography, where he's talking about the war, talked about a little bit of like a kind of like a triangular trade, where we agreed to ship scrap iron to England, so they would let us access some boats, and then we had to agree to send coal to France, and then so it was kind of like a triangular trade sort of, where then the ships would return back to pick up American forces as well.
Exactly. It was the Europeans regularly made totally unrealistic requests of the U.S., somehow thinking that there was an infinite reserve of trained manpower and no problem getting stuff over to Europe. The Italians, Orsino at one point requested Pershing to send 100 divisions to serve in the Italian army, which was actually more troops than we ever had in the American Expeditionary Force. All right. Anyone else? Then thank you all for taking up an hour of your time and listening to our presentation.